Hey everyone, it's Ryan1940. Today we're taking a look at the MI8 HIP on Enigma's Cold War server. The goal here will be to get some of the troop insertions done. I haven't really been flying the HIP since 3 years ago, basically. If you're a hardcore fan of the channel, you might recall a long time ago I did a video on the MI8 HIP. It was called Top Cover, and I just looked it up. This was pre-COVID. It came out January 6, 2019. So since then I really haven't flown the helicopter much because I got sucked into the Hornet and later on the F-14 for a good amount of my time. Since my last video, the Battle of Kutaisi, we've gone through 2 campaigns. Blue won that very long campaign number 5 after 27 days. I then switched sides to Red and flew the Hind. Red would go on to win campaign 6 in 5 days. Campaign 7 would be even shorter. It lasted 3 days and ended in a blue victory. So here we are in campaign number 8. I originally planned to alternate what side I played for with each campaign change, but because some of these campaigns were going so fast, I've decided I'm just going to fly Red for a bit while I relearn the HIP and learn more in the Hind. Luckily, the 2 platforms share some similar systems and flight characteristics, so some of the gained knowledge carry over between the 2. Today we're loaded out with a 12.7mm machine gun in the left door and a 7.62mm machine gun for the rear. I wanted to specifically avoid carrying heavy rocket or gun pods to reduce the drag and also save on the weight so we can use speed to avoid enemy attackers. Also, I want to really get a feel for the aircraft without the excess store weight as a baseline, so later on I'll have a better understanding and expectation of how she'll handle when loaded down. On this server, gazelles tend to wait in ambush positions either in an area where they can see a lot of movement or closer to their ground forces, and they'll opt to attack you once you move in to attack. This gazelle spots a Huey attacking a Hind and jumps in to assist. There are actually 2 Hinds here. One off in the distance is flying incredibly high, and if you looked closely before the LOD change, you would have noticed how obvious it is at range because it's a big flying box. Now this is all happening to my 11 o'clock, and as I race towards the front lines, I keep my eyes on it periodically and notice that they're getting closer towards me. The Hind is doing the smart thing and trying to run away. We see it pulling on the Huey, but the Gazelle is flying an intercept course to try and cut the Hind off. Ultimately, this Hind is going to swing back a little too early, and the result is the Huey and Gazelle are now in very close with a slow and heavy Hind. If you find yourself in this situation, I think it's best to hit the deck and keep the course changes gentle while you make your best speed towards friendly lines. In a crazy twist of fate, a MiG-19 attempts to gun down the Huey but inadvertently hits its main rotor. Both are taken out of the fight, and the Hind is joined by a second Hind as they look for the stray Gazelle. It seems for a moment that the tables have turned. Close by, a HIP is attempting to make a troop landing. Ultimately, the Gazelle passes it without noticing it and attempts to take on the Hinds. The HIP makes a troop drop, but almost instantly after it lifts off, enemy cannon fire destroys the landing zone. As the HIP and Hind start to vacate the area, the Gazelle jumps into position and lays some heavy fire on one of the Hinds. As I get closer to my own landing zone, the whole sky circus has been slowly drifting towards me. I'm confident that they'll eventually get the Gazelle, so I don't alter my course. Ultimately, the HIP will finally dispatch the Gazelle with some 12.7mm fire from above. Not long after that, I find myself a suitable landing area and fly past it, then circle back in to help bleed off my speed and fly us into the wind as we land. The server now has added small amounts of wind into the mission rotation. I'm not sure if it differs when the missions change, but in this particular one, the wind is coming from the south at about 4 to 5 miles per hour. So far I'm not confident in doing very rapid decelerating descents in this helicopter, so the landing is kind of slow. I'm hoping over time as I feel it out more, I'll really know the edge of the envelope and can make some pretty hot landings like I do in the Huey. After a few seconds, we watch our troops deploy and we lift off. The main thing I love about the hip is that in a relatively clean configuration like ours today, we can accelerate and fly away at tremendous speed. The Hind no doubt is the king of speed on this server when it comes to rotary wing aircraft, but the hip is not far behind it. On a sortie or two before the ones recorded in this video, I rolled over a Gazelle hovering under the treetops so fast it didn't know I was there until my left door gunner started shooting at it while we passed by. In fact, I didn't even know it was there because it happened so fast. I never found out if the thing crashed or was destroyed because I gently turned back to friendly lines to make sure I wasn't being chased. After flying over some friendly Shilkas and seeing they weren't shooting at anything, we made our way back into enemy territory for a successful drop. The moral of the story here is use the speed to your advantage. A quick transit later and we are back at the FARP. We come into landing while some other helicopters are getting ready to head out. Like I've said in some of my Huey videos, if you're flying helicopters on the server, just land away from the FARP pads. I see it happen every so often that somebody lands on a pad and the other person spawns in for some catastrophic results. The landing message is pretty generous when it comes to the radius you need to be in around the FARP for it to count, so give yourself plenty of room. Essentially what I aim for in the hip is to descend until I'm into ground effect and then hover taxi closer to the FARP pads. One thing about the FARP is you can be pretty far away from it for the landing message, but when you go and try to refuel or rearm, it sometimes won't work. If this happens to you, all you have to do is just taxi closer to the FARP and the problem is resolved. For this pit stop, we are replenishing some fuel to bring us back to 50%, which is absolutely plenty for the distance we're going round trip. In fact, it's quite a bit extra. I just like to carry the extra fuel in case, sometimes things will come up where we have to evade hazards like some enemy aircraft or something. You might have to go back and forth across the lines to do that. And other times we have some extra fuel so we can try to get some SAR cases that show up while we're transiting and things like that. So we basically have just wiggle room to mess around before we have to get back to the FARP. And another important thing to do when you're at the FARP before you depart is to not only load the 2 squads of troops, but verify that you did that using the check passengers option in the radio menu. It absolutely sucks when you get to an insert point to drop troops and nothing happens and then you find out that you never actually were carrying anyone on board. And yeah, I'm speaking from embarrassing experience, but with DCS there's no visual modeling of troops in the back, so you just don't know if you're not checking to verify that you're carrying troops on board. This evening, blue outnumbered red about 2 to 1, and it was definitely showing in our ground losses. As I fly out across towards the enemy lines, I try to make mental notes of some of the friendly positions and their compositions, whether they're mostly alive or mostly dead, so if I have to turn back and run for AA cover, I hopefully would choose the right ground concentration for maximum effect against any enemy chasing me. It's not long before we are back in the enemy sector and I prepare for another troop drop-off by bleeding speed and turning up into the wind. Unfortunately, my situational awareness is rather lacking and I'm about to put myself down in a clearing well within the range of a handful of 50 cals mounted on some Humvees. When this was playing out live, I was convinced there was some Gazelle that must have been near me and jumped me. Looking over this track file and seeing what actually happened honestly surprised me. I could not believe the AI gunners were able to shoot through trees like that, or even just to spot me. Clearly, from the Humvee perspective, you can see my helicopter, but I thought the AI would be so dumb it would basically have a large blanked out view because of the thick patch of trees. I was honestly impressed by it, and I'll keep that in mind for next time. At this point, we are mortally wounded and our fate is sealed, even though it's not immediately evident to me as I accelerate away. Once again, I think a Gazelle is shooting or chasing me, so I try to hug the treetops and build speed, but we don't get far until I notice violent shaking and I have no control over the engine throttles, and the engines begin to overspeed until we lose both of them at low altitude and high speed. Now the manual that comes with the hip covers some emergency situations, and one of them is dual engine failure at under 100 meters of altitude, which is exactly what we're experiencing right now. I actually didn't read this segment until after the crash landing, but I did want to see what the correct thing to do was. And for the most part I did what it said. Essentially you're working the collective and cyclic to try to decelerate quickly. It does say to close the fuel shutoff levers to both engines, and I didn't do that, but it makes sense for the fire danger during a potentially hard landing, so I'll save that for next time. But what's interesting is in the external view, it really shows off how off I was actually in judging on where the tail was. But from the cockpit view of the whole ordeal, and from what I remember, it didn't seem that I was too aggressive with my flare, but I guess it's just something I need to have more time with the aircraft to fill out where it exactly is in space. Tail or no tail, either way, we make it down alive. I have to say, I'm loving flying the hip so far. The damage modeling and failures seem to vary in severity over time, and you can do corrective actions for them. If any of you hip experts out there know what the initial failure was when I started losing control of the engine throttle, please let me know so I can read up on what to shoot for next time. And with that, I want to thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you around on the server. Bye!